So I'm an engineer from the product team. And in this section of our presentation, what I'm going to be talking about is how we can use Cisco Tetration to help you discover policy for your applications when you don't already have that policy in hand, which for the majority of people that are trying to implement segmentation between applications is the reality. You know, when you're looking at applications, when you're looking at environments that have been out there for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, who knows how long a company has been in business for, the amount of applications that need to be secured is just going to explode. You could have thousands of applications that need to be segmented. Some of those applications might be relatively new. Some of those applications could be years old. The people that wrote the applications, the people that have that intrinsic knowledge of how it works, are most likely either at a new employer or potentially even retired. So relying on human knowledge to be able to help you work out what your application policy should be becomes very, very difficult. Whereas utilizing a system like Tetration, which is going to be able to leverage machine learning and big data and huge volumes of information, which we're going to get into and debunk a little bit, that's going to be able to actually help you derive what that segmentation policy needs to look like without the headache that comes along with it. So let's skip on to this first slide on segmentation. So for those of you that have ever attempted to do segmentation in the past, you probably may have been burned by trying to do segmentation, micro-segmentation, whatever you want to call it. And the reason being is that it's actually a really thorny subject to tackle. It sounds simple at first. I just need to find my applications, and then within inside those applications, I just need to neatly allot the workloads into groups, and then I just need to specify which groups need to speak to the other groups. But once you start to extrapolate out what that looks like in a real life data center with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of workloads and thousands of applications, it really does become a very, very tricky problem to solve. So what Tetration is going to help you do essentially, and this is a slide, so it's kind of abstract, but we'll get into a real demo that will actually show how it works. You want to take what is on the left-hand side, which is typically the starting point for most Tetration customers, some sort of environment with workloads and applications. There's probably already a firewall around the edge of that environment, whether that's firewalling done by a physical device or some sort of virtual firewall. But within inside that zone, everything is kind of like in a mushy soup, and things can talk to each other, and there is no further demarcation between different workloads. What you want to do is get to the right-hand side of this slide here, which is workloads nicely allotted into correct groups, applications, zones, whatever you want to go for. And then between those different groups, policies correctly put in place based on the communication patterns of those applications and workloads, which again sounds like a very simple task, but when you actually try to approach it in real life and you're dealing with these huge volumes of data, it quickly spirals out of control around how easy it is to actually achieve this goal. So let's take a little look about how Tetration can actually help you get to this point on the right-hand side where you can organize your applications without the associated headache. So one of the first things that you need to consider when you are trying to do micro-segmentation or allow listing of applications or implementing a zero trust policy is you have to think about the final goal. And the final goal is to enforce some sort of segmentation. Yet at the same time, you need to be really, really careful that you don't actually break the application while you're doing that. You know, security is incredibly important for businesses, but at the end of the day, the bottom line and earning profit is probably more important potentially than security. That's a probably hot topic for some people out there, but ultimately the business cares about ensuring that the application is running. And if you try to implement micro-segmentation and you break the application, well, you will very quickly find out what it feels like to not be happy, not be on the happy end of a call from the CEO of the business. So what Tetration is out there to do is actually help discover these policies in a way that captures all of the requirements of an application. And what do I mean by all of the requirements of an application? Well, typically there's two ways to look at an application. There is the bottom-up perspective, and this is the way that the application developer typically thinks about their applications. My web tier needs to talk to my app tier, which then finally needs to talk to the database. Yes, that's incredibly important. You have to know that part of the application to make it work. So that's half of the policy. But if you just focus on web talking to app, talking to DB, you're forgetting the other half of the policy. How do the users access this application? What general services does this application rely on? Do I need to be able to speak to my DNS server? Do I need to be able to authenticate via Active Directory? Do I rely on some shared databases or a shared cache? All of those things sometimes are outside of the view of the application developer and more commonly understood by the infrastructure team that understand the general lay of the land of the data center or the cloud environment. And what Tetration is ultimately trying to do is actually complete that whole picture for both sides of the table. Understand what the general requirements are for an application, and also understand what the specific requirements are for an application at the same time. Building that entire policy set is the only way to make sure that you don't break the application. And if you continue to think about that train of thought, breaking the application requires that you see all of the behavior of the application. If you took a 24-hour slice of an application and analyzed what it was doing, you might get around 80% of the typical behavior of that app. But you're missing the crucial 20%. What happens at the end of the week? What happens at the end of the month or at the end of the quarter when reports are generated, when backups are taken? If you don't capture those requirements as well, again, you've broken the application and you've upset management. So it's incredibly important to look at everything that's happening and make sure that as you look at what's happening, you look at that for a very long period of time. Multiple months is the kind of suggestion I'm talking about here to make sure that you capture all of the requirements of a given application. So
is there anything within that capture as far as detection? So people don't actually put into place a really bad rule that something should have flagged?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really valid point, because when you're looking at a brownfield application, particularly, you have no real idea that what that application is doing is actually legitimate. Like, should it actually be doing that? And to answer the question simply, yes, Tetration has built-in mechanisms to do that. And I'll describe a couple. So one of the mechanisms is what Rob was talking about in his session, which is where we can overlay hierarchical policy. So we can put things like prod will never speak to non-prod, or if you're PCI compliant, you're not supposed to speak to anything that's non-PCI. Now, those rules will be taken account of when we discover application policy. And if for some reason the application is actually today contravening those rules, the policy is going to be aware of that, and it's not going to allow that to happen in the future. So it's going to be aware of what you as the kind of centralized IT team can say shouldn't happen. Another thing that Tetration does when it's analyzing the application policy is actually look at the process that is generating the flow data and generating traffic on the network. Because of the point of reference that our agent has, which is on the machine itself, not only do we say, hey, look, this is flow data, but we actually say, look, this traffic is going to this process with this PID, this process name, and we usually even took a hash of the process. And we looked that hash up against threat intelligence feeds, and they say that that's actually a bad, malicious piece of software. That bit of insight is going to be passed on to you as the developer that's generating this policy, and you'll then be aware that something's actually happening on your workload generating network traffic that's known to be bad, malicious traffic. So that's kind of a twofold way of being able to ensure that we don't bake bad policy into the environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's really good. So for that more live feed, is that being expectant on other applications or on a subscription to anything Talos provides, or what's that 0-day information? Where's that coming from?
Yep, it's all bundled in. There's no extra license for any of the threat intelligence feeds. So you'll get things like the NIST CVE database automatically downloaded, the NIST RDS database. We also have reversing labs contracts built into the Tetration platform so that it will actually, be able to do those lookups for you without any additional subscription to you. You also can, as well, if you want to, upload your own threat intelligence databases and known malicious hashes, and also known whitelisted good hashes as well, if you wanted to, provide extra information that you might have. Right, thanks for the question. So we've kind of touched on this quite a few times already, but I will reiterate the point. It needs to be done at scale to really make this work well. I've helped customers deploy Tetration, and when I'm walking into an environment that has 10 applications, 100 applications, 1,000 applications, it's still outside of the realm of something that humans really want to be managing. Even the small shops that have only a handful of applications, keeping up to date with how policy needs to be dynamically adjusted based on an application's lifecycle, it gets incredibly tricky. Now, if you scale that up to doing it for thousands of applications, it simply is like a never-ending job. There is no amount of humans that could possibly keep up with that level of change in the environment and effectively translate that down into a policy that can be enforced on workloads. So this really is a job that is best left to machines. Now, that's not saying that Tetration is, a magnificent AI that's going to take you out of a job and, also make your breakfast for you in the morning. It's a smart use of big data and compute power to make your job as either the application developer or the networking architecture team or the security architecture team to implement segmentation. It is a tool that you use to increase your efficiency and the speed that you can effectively enable segmentation in your environment. And we'll go through into the demonstration to actually walk through, how that tool is made available to you, how you can utilize Tetration to build policy in a way that makes sense for your environment. Now, here is the key point to take note of. Policy for your environment is an incredibly subjective way of thinking about policy, but it's actually the reality of how every organization is. Every real life customer that deploys Tetration is slightly different in its own very small way. Everyone likes to think that they are a snowflake, and the reality is that most organizations are. They all look similar from a distance, but when you really start to zero in on what segmentation means to a given organization, you will very rarely find the same answer twice. The boundaries will look the same, the kind of general shape of the image is going to be the same, but some organizations, like Rob was mentioning in our first session, will like to manage policy at a regional level. I want to create zones between North America and Europe and Australia. Or I want to manage policy at the cloud level. I want to manage policy between different clouds. Other customers want to manage policy at an application level and enforce relationships between applications. Others want to go all the way down to enforcing policy and managing policy at an individual workload or application tier level. No one really has the right answer. And in fact, the right answer is really down to what is the correct amount of risk that your organization wants to take on when it comes to preventing lateral movement. And you need to balance that risk against the complexity of enabling segmentation. Tetration makes enabling segmentation easy and easier than it was in the past, but ultimately you have to think about what is the trade-off for your organization. And Tetration then provides you the right tools to be able to set that kind of slider as to where you want to choose your segmentation granularity to end up at. So, the two key ideas that I really hope are taken away in this presentation when it comes to how Tetration generates policy is this. Firstly, is that it provides a really rich set of ways to model your environment in a common sense way. I know that sounds kind of simple, but for years, for literally decades at this point, people have been modeling their environment, their real life, their organizational environment, based on the way that a switch or a firewall or a network enforcement device has been able to expose its underlying features. And more often than not, the way that is exposed leans towards the way that the machine would like it to be exposed. So for example, that means that you might have to categorize workloads and applications based on subnets, because that's the way that machines like to categorize things, or based on VLANs, because that's the way that that switch works. When you try to translate that to your organization, which hasn't followed those rules, people have deployed applications all over the place. We have application tiers that split across subnets. We have applications that have the front end in AWS and the back end on-prem somewhere. Those things become incredibly difficult to model if you're tied to network constructs. But as soon as you break that boundary and you can start modeling your environment based on labels and annotations and metadata that is outside of the networking realm, it becomes very easy to describe a very simple layout of what your actual organization looks like when it comes to your segmentation rules. So this is where what we call in titration a scope structure is defined. And Rob was showing you how a scope structure can be defined based on those labels and metadata. And it really just kind of like fleshes out what the generalized zones of your environment are. Now I have a campus, I have some cloud stuff, I have applications over here. And those applications might be broke down into sub-business units. And then perhaps inside those applications, you might know that there's a prod application and there's a dev version of that application. But how they interrelate to each other, how they depend on shared services, what they communicate to out on the internet, that part is typically unknown. And that is the part that we are going to rely on titration and its big data environment and machine learning capabilities to be able to generate policy for you. So that's the second key idea with titration. After you've described your organization in a common sense way, you can then let titration analyze all of the traffic that has been traversing your environment for the last week, month, 2 months, quarter, to fill in the blanks. Take that loose skeleton of a description of your environment and truly understand what does it look like from titration's perspective. How is your banking application talking to the insurance application? How do your users access these different applications? What shared services are relied on? Everything is going to be resolved automatically by titration without you having to understand what any of those different relationships looked like prior to implementing the solution. And like we spoke about a few minutes ago, it is going to be aware of the higher order rules. If we have things like non-prod should not speak to prod, that will be taken account of as titration automatically generates these rules for you. It's also going to be as smart as possible to ensure that rules aren't redundantly generated. If we have a generalized rule that discovers all applications are allowed to speak to DNS, for example, I'm not going to recreate the same rule thousands of times for each individual application. I'm going to know that that's already superseded by that higher order rule. If you want to think about it in a different way, it really is like painting by numbers. You define what the general outline of the picture looks like. You define where you want to have certain splodges of color splashed. But titration is going to do the heavy work and the hard lifting of going through and individually coloring in each open cell. It is going to work out exactly what the full and completed picture looks like. And it's going to leverage your time better for spending time on really defining what that structure looks like and what your organization wants policy to look like, and taking away that boring job of filling in the blanks and working out exactly what each individual rule needs to look like. And also if that rule potentially needs to change in the future as an application dynamically changes, like a tier is scaled up or a VM is migrated from one data center to another. Those kind of small underlying details are totally handled by titration, while you get to think about the higher order problems of what my policy needs to look like for my organization. So what we're going to do is start analyzing some policies for my AWS environment. I want to discover all of the policies within inside my AWS zone. So I'm going to create an application workspace in titration. And as you can see right now, it's empty apart from a deny statement. And I'm going to go through and say I would like to automatically discover policies. And I'm just going to change a couple of settings. For example, here I want to discover detailed information from my campus. And I'm also going to say that I want to discover policy in a deep way. I am further going to select a time range. Just going to look at the last hour in this case because we're just doing a demo and we don't need to analyze tons of data, and I'm going to submit that run. What I'm going to do then is we're going to walk backwards now and exactly explain what all of those different things are that I clicked so that you can get some context around it. So let's jump over here first to our scopes. Scopes is that way of describing that organizational tree. You can see here there's a little tree icon up in the corner. And my tree here inside has 4 major zones: AWS, Campus, RTP, and San Jose. Now we're going to be looking at location AWS. And you can see here, I haven't specified IP addresses. I've specified a tag. And this tag is automatically learned by titration. So back in Rob's previous section, when we were talking about automatically connecting to AWS and pulling in metadata from there, that's exactly what you're seeing here. And if I click that query, it can actually tell me that right now, these are the EC2 instances that map to AWS. So I have different objects in here, like a banking application, an insurance application, some databases, some reader stuff. And I can see that there is a dev version of the application, and there is also a production version of the application. And if I come back here, I can drill deeper into here. So again, I've been able to split workloads down deeper based on metadata, not IP addresses. So if a workload is redeployed in a different manner with a different IP address, policy travels with it. The metadata is what pulls that information and applies it to that workload. Now, if I look under insurance, I will see that I have a prod and a non-prod environment. And if I look under prod, I will see at this point, our scope structure has become more detailed. We have only 4 EC2 instances at this point. And again, this has just simply been based on labels or tags or annotations, whatever term you want to use to group these 4 workloads together. And typically, this is about the level of knowledge most customers have when it comes to refining where endpoints belong. Most environments can pin down a VM or an EC2 instance or a pod down to a given application. But within inside that, it becomes a little bit cloudy, and how those relate to external applications becomes even more misty. So that's the level of kind of blueprint that you really have to specify when you're building policy with titration. And I'll pause there. Are there any questions on that blueprint? Okay, so when we move back to our segmentation screen, we clicked on a couple of things. Firstly is our external dependencies here. So we can control how fine and how granular titration goes in terms of discovering policy to external entities. Now, external entities could be something that is inside the same environment. This could be things inside AWS, but it could be things back on-prem. And it could also be campus users accessing applications. And in fact, you can see here that by saying fine, I've actually asked titration to not just show me that campus users are accessing the application by being able to connect titration to sources of identity like Active Directory or ICE. It can further refine that down to individual groups within inside the campus environment. So I can use titration to actually lock down policy to specific groups of employees, helping deal with that potential insider threat issue.
Now, how is it determining things like what might be relevant API calls from internal apps out to the internet versus what might be bad? Like a bad actor type of situation.
Yes. So you can do a couple of things. You can choose to classify the internet as just one big kind of blob, or you can go into more depth and actually split the internet down into smaller subregions. So you can ask titration to listen to threat intelligence feeds that have known IP addresses of bad actors out on the internet. So, if you have known command and control servers, for example, titration can listen to those feeds, and it can then warn you and in fact block policy if, for example, you have an application that's talking to a known command and control server. So it's not just at the level of the internet. It could be down to a specific endpoint out there on the internet. On the flip side, you can do that for good things as well. You can say, my application talks to a SaaS out there, and this is the the block of IPs that belong to that SaaS service. So rather than just saying it's talking to the internet on 443, you can lock it down to a particular SaaS out there on the internet. That's pretty useful.
Are SaaS providers like Salesforce, like O365, are those pre-baked policies, or do they have to be manually added and updated?
So they are not pre-baked into the system as it stands today. You can pull those in via APIs. So we provide a way for you to dynamically tell Tetration about SaaS providers that you use. So you'll find like Office 365, AWS, with their services, most reliable service providers publish a list typically that you can access over an API that specifies their IP ranges. And today you're sort of on the hook for manually translating their IP range into the Tetration configuration. We are actually, working on something that is to be released in the future where we'll be able to help customers and partners and people that are deploying Tetration alike to share these kind of things around, so that you can potentially say, hey, I've mapped out what Oracle looks like. Anyone else that wants to listen to this can actually use that existing Oracle object. So I think what you're asking is a good kind of line of questioning, which is there's a lot of cookie cutter policy out there that could be redistributed between different environments, and we're kind of thinking down the same lines as that as well.
Tim, I had a quick question.
Okay.
Quick question on a follow-up in regards to, it looks like you're using VPC flow log to fill in the data set for at least this one. Is that correct?
No, so for this one, it is, again, through the Tetration agent. So okay. Even though in AWS, I've installed the agent within inside the EC2 instances. What's really nice about that, you could bake that into an AMI, or you can use, if you're using, let's say, Terraform or Ansible to deploy and configure your application. We have open source modules and providers for both of those two systems, so that you can shim the Tetration agent in as you deploy EC2 instances, and then they will register with Tetration and so on. Tetration itself, sorry, carry on.
Well, yeah, so just sort of curious about that, because you guys have on the other side of the camp, you've got all the app dynamics side, right? So there's going to be a certain amount of agent fatigue with application developers. Are you able to ingest the data set from app dynamics to be able to give the same sort of data correlation that you see here? Is there any sort of plan or roadmap so that you don't have to deploy another Tetration agent just to be able to get the same information that the app team is already trying to get around their APM side to get the same insights, so that the ops team can take action based off of what the APM product is already telling them, right?
Yeah, so it's a good sort of way about thinking about this. It's both the app dynamics agent and the Tetration agent go about their way of being deployed slightly differently, which in some way makes it possibly not possible to combine them into the same agent. But at the same time, we are looking at ways about sharing information between App Dynamics and Tetration. The reason I say that is App Dynamics is integrated at the code level, right? So you import App Dynamics into your application, and then that kicks off the whole App Dynamics flow. That means that typically the App Dynamics support needs to be supported by the flavor of the application that you are writing. And moreover, you need to be able to, in most circumstances, get access into the application code to import that agent. Tetration, on the other hand, because we're more of a kind of generic policy discovery engine rather than a application performance tool, our agent sitting at the OS level means that we can pretty much go into any existing application, whether it's a closed source application or it's an application written in a language that App Dynamics doesn't support. So I understand that the kind of frustration or the agent fatigue is suddenly at play here. What I could say is that the Tetration agent is possibly one of the most lightweight agents that you could find out there. It guarantees to use no more than 3% of the CPU available to the workload, and typically it's actually much less than that. It reports and streams data every second, so there's very little caching on the machine, and all of the heavy lifting is done on the SaaS end of the system. So while it's an extra step to implement that agent and make sure it's deployed there, the value that both the developers get, and you'll see this in Remy's session around being able to have control over their destiny and have control over their own policy, far, far, far outweighs any of the perceived negative sides of having to install yet one more agent, which I do still kind of understand because no one really likes having to deploy another agent. I get it.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, though, there's a whole set of who's running policy, because if I'm running APM, right, I want to be able to understand why my policy behavior and performance is going on the way it is. So you're thinking you're controlling it at that level, and then you've got titration, which is now below it, right, in terms of what policy constructs are going on. So it'd be very useful for APM to have, for App Dynamics to have insights into what titration is doing and vice versa, so that way you don't end up writing a set of policy enforcements within titration that really break how APM is actually working for the app team, right? I mean, there's some tension there in terms of what could happen, and I don't want to derail you, but it's just something that
it's what you are describing is 100% the tension that has been there between security teams and development teams and around. How do you ensure that one doesn't break the other while at the same time enabling both to get their job done? And like I said, at Cisco, both Tetration and App Dynamics are part of the same business group. We are working on developments between the two products so that there is a tighter integration between the two. And exchange of information is definitely where I think that play is. I would say just wait till Remy's session, because I think that will really kind of open the eyes around how Tetration really makes the flow of what the developers are doing very, very nice, and they can ensure that Tetration is not going to break anything that's required for their APM tooling.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. So to finish this little bit of our demonstration, so like I said, Tetration uses big data analysis to discover what your policies need to look like and who is speaking to whom. And it gives you a certain amount of knobs that you can tweak, because we all, especially Cisco, we love to have knobs that and allow you to configure things. But the reality is that each organization is going to set a different level of what granularity their policy needs to be. Some customers opt for a very conservative policy compression, where they would like to make sure that they have very, very detailed micro-segmentation rules. Other customers would like to be able to have very aggressive policy compression, where we perhaps generate slightly more generalized rules, but at the same time, it's a much smaller set of policies that are being generated and therefore managed by humans. So it really comes down to what is the risk factor for an organization, and at the same time, what is the operational model that is actually going to work for that organization at the same time. Now we can see that our results are available. So what Tetration is showing me here is what it has discovered. So we can see different parts of this application. For example, allowing banking employees to speak to the prod version of the banking application on port 443. I can see that within inside the banking prod zone, these are the ports and protocols that need to be enabled between the different tiers. I can see insurance employees need to access the insurance application, and also banking, insurance, and services like to access the internet over 443, and that there's a couple of relationships to shared services. And in fact, I can view this policy in a slightly different way, in a more traditional manner that's familiar to folks that use firewalls. Sorry, was there a question there? Okay. So Tetration discovered all those policies. We went from 0 policies to an entire set of rules for this application, and this covers all of the behavior of that app. And I can use the system to find interesting information out. A lot of customers will start deploying Tetration and start asking, well, why did you build that policy? Why is that relationship between those endpoints created? And of course, the system provides a full way to interrogate the database so that you can actually find out why policies were created. The banking system was talking to Redis, and here's the flow that relates to that. What we can also see is some interesting rules that have been ignored. Now, if you remember earlier in Rob's session, he was talking about some of those generalized policies that will get applied to every machine. So for example, everyone is allowed to speak to the DNS server. And that's a policy that is already approved by the infrastructure team, by the centralized security team, whoever it is that generates these generic global policies. So as an app developer, or as the owner of the AWS region, I'm not bothered and I'm not cluttered with all of those generic policies that just are there to make sure that the workload can survive and speak to DNS servers and DHCP servers. All I'm seeing in this particular view of the policy is what matters to my AWS zone. And now I have a full set of zone-to-zone based rules between my different AWS environments. Now, before enforcing, the final piece that we're really going to be able to do is actually see what is the effect of that policy going to be. So here I'm looking at a time series graph of the flow data that relates to these EC2 instances. So every single flow is being monitored and captured, and then it is being compared against the segmentation rules to give me an answer as to what would happen to this application. So we can see that 96% of this traffic would be permitted, and 3.8% of that traffic would be rejected. It would be dropped by the platform. And the reason it would be dropped by the platform, we can actually ask. And I say platform to be specific, I actually mean it would be dropped by the host-based firewall. Again, that's where these policies are going to be deployed at on each individual instance. You're going to have thousands of firewalls working in unison to make sure that this policy is cohesively enforced. So I can see the reason that this traffic will be rejected is because I have development services talking to non-development assets. Someone must have misconfigured this application, which never happens in real life, right? Application people always get it correct. But the reality is it happens. Someone changes an environment variable, someone misdeploys an application, someone's trying to fix a problem on a Friday night before they go home, and they mess something up. Tetration is going to discover that. It sees here that there is a dev workload speaking to a Oracle database, and that is contravening this rule here, which is that non-prod will not speak to prod. So even though it's actually happening on the wire right now, we already have a policy in place that will make sure that we don't allow that traffic going forward. And now remember here, we're just in a simulation setting. We're just analyzing what would the effect be. This has been one of the things that has killed a huge amount of segmentation projects is actually, trying to do the segmentation, but not having the policy correct or not having a way to test that policy. Once you break the application, once, twice, thrice, people start to lose confidence in that segmentation project. Ultimately, I've even seen segmentation projects scrapped because people could never get to a policy set that actually worked and didn't need to get rolled back. But with Tetration, you can tweak and analyze and play with the policy to your heart's content until the point where you know it's not going to break the application based on historical data. Once you get to that point, the actual final step in the chain is enabling enforcement. And that's really easy. That's the bit that really a lot of products used to start at. I'm ready to enforce policies. Let me enforce your policies. But none of them had that way to actually help you understand what the policy needed to be. And that's really where I find Tetration has actually made a great leap forwards for folks that are trying to implement segmentation policy, is go through that whole life cycle of discovering and analyzing and compressing and testing and then finally enforcing policy. And at that point, knowing that when I've pushed these rules into place, I'm confident that I'm not going to break the application. I'm going to reduce lateral movement, and I'm going to have done it all in a way that hasn't actually made me pull my hair out. So with that, I'm going to finish up my demonstration. We can see that I have enforced my policies. And if I look at my application, this is the application that I have deployed up in EC2, I can see that there is red lines now running between all of my workloads that were dev that are now being blocked from speaking to my non-dev workloads. So Tetration is allowing traffic to flow that should be allowed to flow and blocking traffic that should not be allowed to flow, all based on that automatically discovered policy while being aware of the higher order InfoSec rules. So thank you very much for joining me in this session, and I hope you join us for the next one too.
Question. Is there a way for rules that are unused to be automatically flagged for cleanup?
Absolutely. So each of these rules, when they've been generated, we can look at this thing here that says view conversations. So conversations shows us the actual data that was, or the flows that were on the wire that caused this this particular policy to be created. And if you look further, you can see that there is a confidence value to say how high that we believe that this policy should be there. So let's say, for example, I have like a one packet UDP flow. it's going to have a low confidence because we're not really like convinced that that is 100% a legit flow. And in fact, to finish that point, because someone might ask it, if we see TCP sessions that don't get fully established, no, we don't build those into policy. But here for the policy confidence, and then the next point is approval. So if I approve a policy, that means I want it to stay forever and it will never get removed from the system. If I don't approve the policy, it stays in a dynamic state. And the next time I run ADM on the next set of data, let's say that a month later you re-execute ADM, if that policy is stale and no longer actually relates to a flow that we're seeing on the network, it's going to get dropped from the policy set. So the concept is that on a routine basis, you would reanalyze that application to keep the policy set fresh and remove any of the cruft that no longer makes sense for that application.
And are there built-in safeguards to prevent you from putting in a policy that makes it where the agent can't talk to the control center?
Yeah, we have that one. We call it the don't shoot yourself in the foot policy. So the agent always ensures that it has what we call golden rules that make sure that the agent can always speak to the titration cluster. So even if you put a specific deny rule in place that says you can't speak to titration, that will be superseded by the golden rule that will allow the agent to continue to talk to the platform.